Welcome to the third meeting of the Media Workers Coronavirus or CV-19 Crisis Group. And tonight we have a stellar cast, as they like to say. We'll be joined by Ken Loach, who really needs no further introduction, I guess, but the UK's foremost film producer. Christopher Hurd. If you're as old as me, I don't look like I'm 59 or something. But anyway, you'll remember Christopher, and you'll remember the Insight team, the acclaimed Insight team from the Sunday Times of under Harold Evans, from the late 60s through the 70s to the early 80s, I think, to 81. And Christopher was the editor of that acclaimed team of investigative reporters. So we'll be hearing from Christopher also. Sinead Kerwin, who is a filmmaker, a young filmmaker who's going to tell us about trials and tribulations, of which there are many in this corona pandemic. Sinead is the producer of Still the Enemy Within and Dying to Divorce. And finally, Michael Pooler. We'll hear some words from Michael on, who's a member of the National Union of Journalists National Executive Committee, and we'll be hearing some words from Michael, in particular about the NUJ recovery plan, for example, the idea of taxing Google, among other things, and how that all fits into the media landscape. But before we hear from any of those speakers, we'll first hear, as we always do, from someone from the front line to set the scene, because we are an activist group. We're trying to do our little bit as a ginger group to help journalists and people in the media speak truth to power through whatever medium is theirs, and to also organise in our industry to push back against the massive job losses and the remaking of the industry that is going on, and to make sure that we defend journalism and defend the truth in whatever way we can. So to start off, we'll have a quick statement from Lorna Solomon, who's a health worker at the Homerton Hospital. For those who don't know, that's in East London. And I believe you're also the chair of the public service union Unison. So over to Lorna to kick us off.
Hello, thank you for asking me to speak. I'm not actually, I'm no longer chair of Homerton Unison, but I am still a very active representative there. So I mean, there's so many issues that it's really difficult to know where to start. I guess that obviously at the moment, the number of cases in hospitals are coming down and the pressure on our acute and intensive care beds is reduced. But we've had to significantly reduce other services in order to deal with COVID-19 and not put other patients at risks. And we're finally talking about opening those services up again and being able to treat patients who need healthcare for other reasons. And in this context, what we're worried about is what happens when people go back to work on crowded public transport, what happens when schools open up. It seems absolutely crazy to be talking about opening schools, in particular for the youngest age group who can't possibly social distance. So everybody that I've spoken to is 100% behind the National Education Union's 5-test campaign. I think there's been a lot on the news today about evidence for schools not being likely to produce new outbreaks and so on. But I think the evidence from what I've read is very contradictory. It seems that only half of the evidence is actually being reported, and the government seems to just follow the science that it chooses to follow. It strikes me, I guess, that if the BMA is backing the National Education Union's position, then it's pretty obvious that it's sensible to wait for more evidence before schools return. So health workers pretty much behind that. The other thing was just to sort of, in terms of understanding that PPE is about protecting the person wearing it, but it also protects our patients and reduces spread. So we're not even confident in the hospitals about supplying consistency of PPE, certainly not confident about it in the care sector. So really worried about talking about a wider return to workplaces. The other issue that I sort of wanted to mention was the that's been so important for us is the issue around increased risk of our Black and minority ethnic colleagues that are facing from COVID-19. In our hospital, we have 50 52% of our staff are from BAME backgrounds. So you can see this is a huge issue for us and really, really important. We have 3 members of staff who've died at Homerton, and they're all from BAME backgrounds. So as a union, we've been pushing for risk assessments that take account of ethnic background as a specific vulnerability. And I think that finally we are actually getting there. But that's only part of it. We need to look at the deployment of staff and the issues around, you know, how staff have been deployed and reducing risk there. I guess these are the immediate actions, but of course the fundamental thing is looking about racism and the structural inequalities in society that lead to all of this. And really institutional racism within the NHS is well documented, and this is a call to arms to us to actually, you know, really go on the offensive on this. So really, very finally, I just wanted to conclude sort of by saying that health workers are incredibly grateful for the support they've received, but they are exhausted, particularly those that have been on the front line. It's physically challenging working in PPE all day, doing long shifts, doing extra shifts, and the emotional impact is huge. So when we heard last week that the government is planning to thank us all for the work that we've done with a 2-year pay freeze, my colleagues were absolutely furious. The fact that Johnson later announced that this would not be the case is an indication that he's under pressure. We need to make sure that we keep up that pressure so that it doesn't happen.
Thank you so much.
That's it, really. That's a kind of a synopsis of a feedback from.
Thank you very much, Lorna. And I think people should know that there's a lot stirring in the country in terms of a pushback against the government trying to force us back to school. I've just heard that there's a meeting ongoing at the moment with 20,000 teachers on it online, which is a ginormous meeting, quite unprecedented. So that shows you the level of anger I think that there is from ordinary people in this country with the lies we've had to put up with for the past 7 weeks and longer from this government. Okay, so as I say, we're an activist group, and so please get over to the Facebook page for Media Workers CV19 and leave your questions for our guests tonight. And if you want to reach out to anyone on the front line to get their stories out into the media, that's what we're all about. Okay, with no further ado, Pandemic Profits and the Media We Need is the headline title, and Ken has joined us, come straight from his uni meeting, I believe, which is excellent, and I'd encourage everybody to be a member of the appropriate trade union. Ken is perhaps the most prominent member of BECTU, and for people that don't know what BECTU is, that's the Broadcasting, Entertainment, Communications and Theatre Union. Ken is going to speak for about 10 minutes on getting the stories out. How can we do that in the media of today, dominated by conglomerates like Amazon, Apple, and all the others? So, Ken, if you'd like to.
Wow. Well, hello everyone, and thanks for asking me to come. I'm feeling completely out of my depth here because my experience is of a different. As regards broadcasting, it was mainly of a different age, and as I explained to Mike Simons, who asked me to speak, I'm not exactly quite certain what my contribution can be. I think I thought it might be useful just to put some kind of historical perspective on it, and to when we consider trying to get stories into the either on the main channels or the press, to something of our experience. I think they are now being pushed aside by the new technology, and in many respects that's a good thing. But we know how dangerous that technology can be, and the abuse and the vilification and the attacks and I've had some little experience of that, and I know others have had far worse. So it is very much a mixed blessing. But the technique for doing that is something I don't know. So I apologise for that. I'm sorry if what I say is maybe a little at variance with what people really need to hear now. I think our experience was at the BBC and doing contemporary fiction. And a number of things came very quickly apparent. First with the BBC and the other main arms of broadcasting are basically arms of the state. Their appointments are dominated by political, are made by politicians, dominated by politics, and their commitment to upholding their idea of what a liberal democracy is and the power structures within it is complete. And their idea of what the point of balance is in any dispute is pretty precise. Their point of balance is the employers have to make a profit before you can defend anything, and therefore they will defend. They will see strikes and collective organisation by the working class as a kind of interference with democracy rather than as an expression of it. And out of curiosity, there's a historical notes. This goes back to 1926, to the general strike, when our war hero Winston Churchill was all for taking over the BBC and using it as a weapon in the war against the trade unions and the miners. And Baldwin, who was much more astute, said, no, it's much better that people think it's objective and telling the truth, and then they will believe it. And that's actually what happened. And I think Lord Reith actually wrote his stuff or did his work from a government office, from what I remember. At least I wasn't alive, not quite, but nearly. But I believe that's the story. Certainly it was, let's pretend they're objective, pretend they're independent, and then they will have credibility. And that's continued really largely up to this day. We found there are levels of tolerance. First of all, when the management and the ruling class are confident, you can say much more than you can when they're nervous and unconfident and feel that their system is vulnerable and shaky. Secondly, there's a hierarchy of tolerance. The most, you can say the most in fiction and in arts programs. You can say much less in documentaries, and you can say almost nothing in the news. So that some of us with our sort of background, my sort of background, we can make fiction sometimes, very rarely make a documentary. And when it is, it's siphoned off with a health warning, and then it's kept a million miles away from the news. And that hierarchy of tolerance is I think is something we learn very quickly. There's been no golden age of tolerance, although it was certainly easier back in the day. But when we were doing contemporary fiction, which we like to think of as quite radical, Peter Watkins' War Game, which was about the dangers and the horrors of nuclear war, was forbidden. So that was in the 60s, that was in the tolerant 60s. And because it was seen as too precisely authentic. And we did a series on the conflicts within the labour movement in this just after the First World War and in the 20s. And that was only broadcast once, not broadcast again. And I think the change came in the 80s and the remodeling of television, of broadcasting, where the whole issue of commissioning editors and the power being taken away from producers and put into the hands of commissioning editors. And whereas before you could make something, they didn't like it, they would stop it going out, then it became, you won't get this commissioned. So the idea is still born if they feel it's dangerous. And there are all kinds of ways of dealing with that. I mean, they won't say that outright, but the process of suppression of points of view, of analyses, and other ways of looking at the world, when they're on the sensitive issue of class conflict and organising in unions and challenging the status quo, that really comes in at that commissioning level. I mean, our experience in the 80s, for what it's worth, I was doing documentaries then. I did about 7 or 8 documentaries. 6 of them were stopped. 6. One was on the steel strike. That was taken off the national the national broadcast and put into a region sometime later in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, saying that the steel strike should never have been sold out. I did 4 programs called Question of Leadership, which was challenging the idea of the trade unions' response to Thatcher, which by and large was a right-wing response. In other words, the trade union leaders were on the one hand being vilified as people who were holding the country to ransom. In fact, they were doing deals with big employers and with unions like British Leyland and so on, accepting redundancies, accepting factory closures, with a payoff. And their success was claimed to be the payoff, but they sold the jobs. And that colluded in the rise of unemployment to 3.5 million from much lower, obviously. So, and they were banned, 4 programs banned completely. We made them, it was rank and file people talking. It was stories from the front line, from the shop floor, people who had occupied factories to stop their closure. It was the union leaders who got them out. And this was story after story after story. The electricians union, led by the infamous Frank Chappell, became Lord Chappell, who would close down branches that were seen as recalcitrant, who were too obstreperous, who challenged his leadership. So the issue of right-wing the unions, the issue of how they respond to the needs of their members, as opposed to doing a deal with employers, has a long history, and they were very precisely charted there. The films are very ordinary. I mean, there's nothing special about them, but the people they suppressed, these are people who've never, this is maybe probably 60, 70 people who appeared in them all, who all spoke. They were stopped from broadcasting. People who had never spoken before on television, never allowed to speak again, never allowed to speak then, censored, stopped. By a cabal, by a group of the heads of Channel 4, the heads of Central TV who'd made the programs, and the Broadcasting Authority. And they were all, many of them were right-wing Labour who joined the SDP. So they were all banned. That's the most egregious example of censorship that I had. Did another film on the miners' strike for an arts programme for Melvyn Bragg. And it was the song, I tried to get a documentary made about it, because the line from the broadcasters was, this is about picket line violence. This is not about the closure of pits. This is not about any unjust action by the government. This is about picket line violence. And they all colluded in that. Kate Adie and all the most celebrated broadcasters, they told that story. The problem is violent miners on the picket line. I was desperate to make a documentary. I'd have done one about gardening and miners' allotments, but couldn't get into that. Did one for the South Bank show on the songs and poems arts. That was then, of course, what they sang about, with the police hitting them over the head with truncheons. That was seen by, if we made this very quickly, that was seen by Melvyn and somebody Elliot who rang South the London Weekend Television. They said, no, you can't show this. We're not showing this. And I said, well, if they're doing it in South Africa, in South America or South Africa, anywhere like that, you'd be rushing to get it on. No, they wouldn't show it. And I was told if I took out the police violence, then they'd show it. So I said no. And eventually it was shown on Channel 4 when the strike was nearly over. So that was probably 4 or 5 months later. It was effectively stopped until the strike was about to collapse. And that was the 80s. And I guess things have gone downhill ever since. And now the manipulation, as I just caught the tail end of what you were saying at the end. I wish I heard Dawn. It sounded really important, what you were saying. Sorry I missed it. But clearly there is a problem now with getting an alternative perspective out. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say was when we're making programs, or when we're putting out short pieces or long pieces, it's really important we get to the heart. We get to the very heart of the issue. We don't beg questions, which is what the mainstream media do all the time. I mean, throughout this health crisis, of course, we've heard the issue of the protective equipment. The government has failed, and there's been some feeble attempt by the Labour opposition to point this out. Academics and nurses and health workers, care workers have pointed it out brilliantly, passionately and clearly. But that point has been raised. The failure to test has been raised. The slow response has been raised. And of course, they're all very important points. But in a way, we need why has that happened? And it's the series of why questions that the programs peter out. So why did that happen? Well, the issue of austerity has been mentioned. Yes, that has been mentioned. That the health service was run down. And of course, and that allowed the point that the protective equipment was, the stocks were run down, they were out of date, they had stickers over them with 2 dates, each of them out of date, and they were still being handed out. Austerity, yes, that point was made. But then, why was there austerity? And the privatisation of the NHS has really not been questioned. The way the money has gone into companies who have paid out their shareholders and had their workers on 0-hours contracts or short-term contracts. And the campaign group Keep Our National Health Service Public has been saying this, but you've noticed they haven't been featured in the mainstream media. It stopped at austerity. That's where their questions have stopped. And what we have to do is go beyond that and say, this is tied to privatisation. It is tied to the idea of a national care service for care workers. They're on 0-hours contracts. They're on, because they're agency workers, on 0-hours contracts. They can be sacked at a moment's notice. They don't get the full minimum wage because they're travelling, unpaid, many of them, between one home and another. These questions are not raised as far as I've seen, and even beyond that, there's a why. Why does the government behave like this? And I think we have to get to the point of it is ideologically that's their ideological commitment is to the market, and the market cannot plan and will not plan. So if we challenge their failure to deal with the health crisis, we have to get to their ideological position as a free market, laissez-faire movement, party, government. And that's the job of Labour opposition, which is not doing. It's the job of the Corbyn-MacDonald leadership, and they did do it to an extent because it's in their manifesto, National Care Service, end privatisation of the health service, and so on. Every health worker to have a union contract. Now, these are issues that I think we need to get to when we're making programs, we're making short films, we have some access to social media, got to get this question of answers so nothing is begged. You know, we get to the root of who these people are, the class interests they're representing, and why they have colluded in tens of thousands of people dying. So, I'm sorry, that's a rather long response to the question. I guess the only other thing to add, which is rather irrelevant really, is that the issues of filmmaking that concern me really for all the time I've been doing it are, with the new technology, become almost redundant. The technical issues of lighting and framing, and the lens you use, and the how you treat people in front of the camera, and how you try to elicit some truth and authentic responses, and the time you have to do it, and the people you work with, and the rhythms of editing, I mean, all huge issues in themselves, but that's a way of filming that when you're making a short piece for the internet is almost redundant, because it has to be, and the lenses, I noticed the lenses people use when they're using a phone or a small camera, they're all wide angle lenses, distorts people's presence, it reduces them to objects really, which is why I hate doing these things, but it reduces them to a kind of goldfish bowl shot, so the aesthetic sense changes, and some things have to be disregarded in order to get a sharp message on social media that people can acknowledge and pass on, and on which we can build a movement. So there's a very, and that's why I feel I'm out of my depth here, there's a very different aesthetic in filmmaking, which I'm very conscious of. And mine is geared to the cinema, and guess people my generation are. But what is needed now is something very different. But I guess the main point I wanted to make is, when we have a big issue, don't leave any question unbegged. We have to get to the absolute core. And the core always tends to be the same one. It's a conflict between classes. And that's why so many have died. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was extremely pertinent and relevant, especially watching the briefings from Downing Street, where we see that writ large, I think, which begs the question, was there ever a halcyon day for the media when journalists did actually do their jobs and actually ask questions to the people that are lying blatantly in our faces, which doesn't seem to have been happening over the past few weeks. But Christopher Hurd was successful in getting a niche in mainstream media and was able to tell some stories that spoke to the truth. So how did you do it, Chris? And are there lessons for today?
Oh, I think it's, first of all, just important that my contribution to this put in sort of its proper historic context. You did correctly introduce me at the beginning that I was the editor of Insight on the Sunday Times. I was actually the last editor of Insight as a team within the Sunday Times, because I was sacked from that by Andrew Neil, who had been appointed to be the editor by Rupert Murdoch. And indeed, the great days of Insight were really at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, and part of the explanation of that lies with some of the forces that Ken actually just referred to that predated the mid-70s and the 80s. But I am going to just talk a bit about Insight, seeing as I've been asked to, but I have since then been, well, for the last 12 years, I have been a documentary producer and have managed to, well, I'm John Pilger's producer, among other things. So we have managed to produce 4 of John's films in the last 10 years, last of which was a tremendous film, The Dirty War on the NHS, raising just the very questions that should be raised virtually every day on mainstream media, but aren't. And I've also been the editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, on which I'm still on the board of that. And I think there is a bit that we can learn from the way that is funded that might help us address some of the questions of getting the media we need. So, I will just briefly say a bit about the Insight team. I mean, it may seem a bit odd, I think, to some viewers that the people we talk about something that actually was over 50 years ago that it was the Insight team was doing its work. It was, for those who don't know, a team within the Sunday Times that didn't have the obligation to write anything every week or indeed every month. It was allowed to go off more or less on its own accord and investigate something that it thought was wrong and needed exposing. And it's probably best known indeed for the investigation it did into the thalidomide affair. And very briefly, for those who don't know, this was a drug that was given to pregnant women to deal with morning sickness, and in the case of a very large number, led to them giving birth to children who had the most terrible physical and sometimes physical deformities and mental problems, and also lots of things wrong also with their internal organs. And the Sunday Times investigation was absolutely revealed that distillers, the same people who who were the distilling company, but who were also in the drugs industry at that time, revealed that they knew that this was a dangerous drug, that they should not have brought it to market, revealed that they, of course, tried to suppress this, and it also revealed the way in which distillers intimidated the families who wanted to get compensation. And as a result of the Sunday Times investigation, massive increases were made in the compensation that distillers were forced to pay. But I think it is also important that I have just said as a result of the investigation, but one of the things that was critical about that investigation was that it was not just the journalism that did it. It was because this was done in conjunction with organizations in civil society, such as the families of the children who'd suffered, in conjunction with activists and campaigning groups, in conjunction with politicians. And I think this is this is a very important point that I wish to emphasize, that I think the success of journalism generally comes about because it exists in a social situation, and it's when it works with other, with organizations in society to achieve change. And it was, interestingly, and I think highly relevant at that time, that Harry Evans, who was the editor of the Sunday Times when Insight did that, and other massively important investigations, including, for example, exposing the way in the British Army had been torturing Republican prisoners in Northern Ireland. It was a very wide spread of stuff they investigated. Harry Evans was absolutely committed to the idea of campaigning journalism to change the world. And I think one of the sort of values of journalism that was eroded during the 80s and the 90s for the same forces that indeed that Ken has outlined, was the idea that journalism has this greater social purpose. And I think, so that's one of the reasons why Insight was successful, but there were actually two others as well, from which I think we can also learn something. That the Sunday Times was a proprietor-owned paper owned by a man called Roy Thompson, who was not by any means a left-winger, right? But he just did have, as it happened, this belief that journalism had a greater purpose than just making money, and that editors should be allowed to get on and do what the right thing was. And he gave Harry Evans, the freedom to do that. However, and I think this is the third thing that is very important, the Sunday Times was a profitable newspaper. I think it is open to question, whether Roy Thompson would have been that keen on the paper going round causing trouble if it had been losing money for him. The Times, which he also owned, did lose money, but he didn't care about that. He was thrilled to be the publisher of the Times. So there was this particular constellation of forces at work there, that that there was an organization that was financially self-sustaining, there was a culture within it which was committed to doing something important, and there was a proprietor who supported that. And it existed, of course, in a world in which this was the 1960s and the 70s, in which social organizations like trade unions were strong, and in which the ruling class were in many cases on the defensive. So I think it's very important to see what it did in those circumstances. Now, I think if you look at where we are today, there's a couple of observations worth making. The first thing is that we have got in this country, fortunately, still one newspaper, which is not owned by a proprietor, that is committed to right-wing values and upholding the status quo. And that newspaper, of course, is The Guardian. Now, I'm not going to have detailed discussions about the policy of The Guardian or the failures of it as journalism, but because I'm sure people have opinions on that. But the point that I want to make about it is that this is a paper that is owned by a trust, non-profit-making trust, that's only job is to publish the newspaper. It happens to be, for a variety of historic reasons, an organisation that has over £1 billion worth of investment. That's the endowment that enables The Guardian to exist. And that is also the thing that has enabled The Guardian to move from a position in which it could easily have been wiped out by the changes, the technological changes that swept through published newspapers, has enabled it to get to the other side of that. And that The Guardian now is almost a profitable paper. right? I mean, and in 2019, it only lost, and this sounds like a lot of money, £7 million, but in the scale of it, it's not that big. And anyway, it didn't matter because it's owned by an organisation that has, £1 billion worth in the back of investments. Probably slightly less now, but still very secure. And I think this is the point that I'm keen to make about the having financial sustainability or financial security is really critical to being able to conduct, serious, public journalism with a public purpose. I think the second thing, which I think is observation I'd make, which is obviously based upon my experience at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is the Bureau is entirely funded by philanthropic support. It was set up by very rich businessman, and it is now funded by a wide range of grants from a lot of organizations, a lot of charitable, philanthropic organizations in this country and in America and in Northern Europe. And I do think that it is very, very difficult to see how you can produce, high quality, good journalism that does, and I think I absolutely agree with Ken, the terrible problem in journalism is that every single question that should be asked is not asked. The assumptions lie behind, the assumptions of a certain order of things lie behind so many of the questions that issues just that should be discussed aren't discussed. If you want to break that open, the only, that you can own, and if you don't have an organization that has financial stability, such as say the Guardian and the Sunday Times had when Roy Thompson owned it, it is a philanthropic venture, and it's a massive challenge to find people whom are willing to provide money to support those sorts of journalistic ventures. But it's not impossible, and I think that when I was at the Bureau, I think our total income from philanthropic contributions was of the order of about £600,000 a year, and it's now over £2 million. Nothing, not to do with my achievements, but my successor who's managed to do that. So I found that reasonably encouraging that it can be done. And then the third thing that I just want to say was, and I possibly because Mike Simmons asked me to talk about this, is that is whether or not I think that it is possible to fund journalism on a crowdfunding basis, where instead of having a small number of people giving large amounts of money, which is how the Bureau is funded, you have a large number of people giving small amounts of money. Now, we've had quite a bit of experience of raising money on crowdfunding for some of the documentaries we've made, and indeed we have raised money for John Pilger's films on crowdfunding appeals, and we have needed it as well. I mean, it's been, relatively substantial amounts of money have been needed, and we have. But I do think that, and Sinead may have something to say about this, because obviously I know that Still the Enemy Within raised, of which I was the executive producer, by the way, also raised some money at crowdfunding. It is a massive struggle, and I think I would caution people against the idea that the future of high quality journalism lies in in crowdfunding appeals, because it's an enormous struggle to raise the money, and you need to have the money on a sustainable basis. However, I mean, so that's, in conclusion, what, I would say, I think I'm just about having 10 minutes, is we have managed to make some really impressive pieces of work in the last 10 years. We have managed to raise that. I absolutely agree with Ken that there wasn't a golden age, or the golden age was so short, it was for very particular reasons. But what our challenge now is to draw upon all of the resources, all of the knowledge we've learned with social movements outside of journalism to be able to create those sustainable organizations, or to put pressure on the ones like The Guardian to make sure they're up their game. So there you are.
For that contribution. And I'd urge everyone to get their questions ready or put them up on Facebook Live now for Chris and for Ken and for Sinead coming next. And so get sharing, get the watch parties going. And I should give a shout out for John Pilger's film on the NHS. timing of this broadcast was odd, straight after the election. We needed it actually about a month or two before the election. I think that might have been deliberate, but there we are. And also for the Timex film, I don't know if anyone's seen that. That was on in the middle of the night, 11 o'clock or something, the Timex strike in Dundee. I don't know if people know about that one, but look that up. There's a brilliant film showing the fight of working class women to actually defend their jobs. Okay, Sinead, up next, a young filmmaker who will speak about the troubles of trying to actually fund a film, The Enemy Within, and your other one on Crying for Divorce. Sinead.
Well, I was actually, young might be a bit of a stretch as I'm 35, but you know, I'll take it. What I actually wanted to talk about more than sort of specifically filmmaking was the challenge facing people who work in the film industry at the moment, because the idea that you're going to kind of get new and original stories really is important about who's behind the camera as well. And at the moment, people are really, really hurting. I'd say the number one concern for filmmakers, maybe young journalists as well, is financial. They've been completely left out in the cold by the current system. The self-assessment thing that the government offered was a good step in the right direction, but it showed an absolute lack of knowledge of the way the film industry is organised in Britain and how people work and how people are paid. So I was on a Big Bet 2 call earlier. I'm on a sort of WhatsApp group with filmmakers in Edinburgh with about 25 people. And I'd say one person out of 25 has had successful access to any financial support from the government at the moment. So they introduce a system where you can apply for, if you're sort of self-employed, for funding from the government. If you make over 50% of your income self-employed, most people who work in films or longer format do not get paid that way consistently. They get taken on short-term contracts. So they have been immediately excluded from that support. Even the system itself, as it's come in, is extremely glitchy. People have applied and their partner with exactly the same income as them have been rejected and they've been accepted. And the government has denied that this has happened, but it has. Like people with accountants have been complaining about it. So it kind of makes you think about what happens to the people who are runners who've just been in the industry 2 or 3 years, who probably don't have an accountant who can apply for this kind of funding. And it's really, really hit people who have set up small limited companies, which is a lot of people like camera guys, because you need to have a limited company really to get the proper insurance if you're going to buy equipment, if you're going to go out and make documentaries, if you're going to get the insurance necessary to sort of protect yourself to go out and make maybe lower budget or lower end films. So I think it's a really big problem. And I think it's a problem that needs to be addressed, because we're going to lose. The film industry is already very heavily weighted to people who have an independent income, who have some form of money that can, so they can take time out to do internships, to do low paid running work. And I think the current crisis is going to massively hit and take away all those people, all the progress that has been made, because so many people are talking about getting other jobs now. And I'm also concerned by the situation economically that people have been put in, that they're going to be forced to go back to work way too soon. So it was announced this week that the UK screen industry is basically back up and running. And that is before we've had any guidance on safety at all. And the guidance that's sort of been drafted at the moment, that's been put out by kind of our industry bodies, Vector and stuff, is quite good if you're kind of running a 60 million to 100 million pound film. If you're doing your first documentary, or if you're doing a low budget short film, it's not really applicable to you at all. So I think it's something that's a real worry for me. And I am really, really worried about safety. I'm really, really worried about young people being forced to go back into dangerous situations without any recourse. The main sort of bigger body that the broadcasters have sort of come together to release some kind of guidance on what is safe and what is not safe is almost like it could have been written by Boris Johnson. It's things like, make sure your crew is absolutely minimal, so basically cut jobs. At the same time, make sure everything is cleaned 50 times a day. Make sure that you're filming outside if you possibly can. Make sure you've also got tons and tons of space for people to wash their hands and have massive breaks. It's just completely illogical. And there's a very strong emphasis in the sort of broadcast things not to use PPE, which I think is very problematic, because the reason that they'll be saying that is because they don't want to be forced to be held accountable for not providing PPE on set when they could do. So I think at the moment, I think part of the issue with COVID is not only trying to get the immediate story out there, but also making sure that you actually have working class people coming up through the industry and not being driven into extreme poverty at the moment and driven out of the industry, so that there are actually people interested in those kind of stories going forward. And I would say I don't think crowdfunding is necessarily the best thing to do, because I think there needs to be pressure needs to be put back on the government, definitely for the film industry, that it's not down to individual producers to decide what's safe and what's not. It should be the government that is making the situation safer so film work can resume. So I think those are the main things I want to talk about. I do think there are going to be a lot of really great documentaries that come out of this, because I think people are getting really angry. People are suddenly realizing that they are part of society. People in the film world who maybe didn't really see themselves as working class before are suddenly made very sharply aware that they are actually working class. And I think there's been a very good turn towards Beck2. Beck2 has been pretty silent the whole time that I've been a producer or coming up in the film industry, but now there's quite a lot of good engagement. I just was on a 2-hour meeting with people from Beck2. I've never done one of those before. There's a real push to sort of re-engage people with the union, to organise, and I think to really start to question health and safety and collective action. So I think those are the positive things that are coming out, but I do think it's quite important to take seriously how damaged the film industry might be from this, in terms of the people behind the camera as well as the people in front of it.
Thank you, Sinead. And just like to say that this group is about action, and so every Saturday we have a coffee morning which is about organising in our localities and with other industries, and getting together with other trade unionists and trying to get some stories out there, and as well as actually organising ourselves. And the question of what the unions can do certainly seems to be the case. Wherever the unions are standing up and starting to represent and fight for people, they're putting on members. So what about the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists? We're going to hear from Michael Pooler from the National Executive Committee. We'll say a few words about what the union is trying to do with its action plan or recovery plan, and how we can help to try and get that taken notice of by the employers and the government. Michael.
So thanks for the invite. My day job is as a news reporter at a national newspaper, and I'm a lay member of the NUJ's NEC. And just in my day-to-day job, really, this crisis has highlighted the structural flaws in many of the business models that underpin journalism. And what we see is something of a paradox now, where people who are stuck at home, or because of lockdown, they're furloughed, or simply they want to know what the situation is with the pandemic, they're consuming news more than ever. The company I work for, we've had loads of new subscribers. We're behind a paywall. We've got really high levels of engagement. You're seeing it across a lot of news media, not in print, but online. And yet, despite these really high levels of readership and engagement, it doesn't translate into revenue. And so it's leaving them in a more financially weak position. And that obviously has a lot of implications on jobs. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had really grim news from BuzzFeed, which is shutting its entire UK news operation. An online business publication, which was really high quality, called Quartz, is laying off employees and closing its London office. And there've been swinging cuts at lots of local and regional newspapers in particular, which were already in a really, really parlous state because of the collapse of the advertising market over the past 10 to 15 years. Journalists at other publications have been put on furlough, and it's an especially torrid time for freelancers. Where I work and at other publications, this is one of the areas where you can cut costs because they're not staffed, so it's not biting into your fixed costs. And yet, the irony is, of course, that this is a time when it's more important than ever for us to hold authorities to account. For all the criticism of the mainstream media, there has been some terrific reporting, both on the science around the virus, but also around government action or inaction, as it is in many cases, in response to the virus, and also inadequate planning. So you've seen everything from The Guardian exposing chaos at the outsourced PPE stockpile company, through to the Sunday Times chronicling the weeks leading up to the crisis, the FT as well covering things around testing. And what we've seen is that some of this critical reporting has led to quite extraordinary responses from the government, where they've come out and given these unbelievable responses following publication of stories, basically accusing the publications and the journalists of fake news. This happened against the FT, where I work, happened against me personally, it happened against the Sunday Times, where they wrote a 3,000-word blog post trying to take apart the story. But when you actually read it, it didn't fundamentally detract from the reporting. It happened as well last week to the Manchester Evening News, which reported on how homeless support for homelessness, which was rolled out for the crisis, is now, some of it is being withdrawn. So the industry finds itself under attack from the government at the same time that it's facing a lot of financial pressures. So to return to the point about the union, the NUJ has formulated a recovery plan for the news industry. And this really builds on a lot of the lobbying work that the NUJ have been doing already. And it kind of falls into two broad buckets. And one of them are short-term aims, and the other ones are more medium-term aspirations. So in the short term, the union is calling for a windfall tax of 6% on the tech giants, using the digital services tax so that it can fund a news recovery plan. Now, this is a long-running complaint, both of the industry and of the union, about the way that a lot of the social media or internet platforms effectively make money from journalistic content that it should be the basis of their livelihoods. And from speaking with from the NEC meetings, it does sound like there is more of a shift in tone inside government and among the politicians to act a bit more robustly on this. Other things that the unions are calling for are tax credits and interest-free loans to support journalist jobs for frontline reporters covering the crisis. One of its demands is no public money for firms making redundancies, giving massive executive bonuses, or blocking trade union organisation. Other asks are for strategic investment by the government through advertising. Now, we have noted there has been a public information campaign with central and local government taking out ads, but the union has noticed and is critical of the fact that it only seems to be benefiting members of the main news publishing organisations, not smaller hyperlocal publications or those that are more independent or community-based news publications. Another ask is for more funding by the Nesta Future News Fund for innovative and public interest journalism, and finally free vouchers for online or print subscriptions to all 18 and 19-year-olds, and tax credits for households with subscriptions. So there's a whole array of stimulus measures, basically, from direct support through to more indirect measures that would get people paying for consuming news. In the medium term, there's perhaps more ambitious things around the establishment of a government-funded journalism foundation that would actually fund public interest journalism, conferring assets of community value status on local newspapers, a bit like community pubs, to ensure that titles are preserved for potential community ownership, and a whole range of other things like tax breaks, rate relief, and other financial support. And from my point of view, I think even as we're seeing lots of job cuts, this crisis has underlined the importance of unions, not just in the media, but also in the wider economy, something that, despite all these terrible job losses that we're seeing in swathes of the economy and people who are going to be facing very hard times, we have seen something of if not a resurgence, then an increase in the prominence of the trade union movement. We saw that the Trade Union Congress was very involved in lobbying the government, and also collaborating with the government and employers' organisations in putting together the support packages, both for companies when it came to financing measures, but also for the furlough scheme. And the NUJ lobbied the TUC very hard for self-employed people and freelancers who make up a big part of our membership to be included in some of these measures. At my company, we've actually had quite a few people signing up for the union. We're already quite a heavily unionised workplace, and we're very representative, but we're very encouraged to see we've had more people joining up, whether that's for reasons of self-interest or whether it's because they can see that we're doing work, and we're having weekly consultation meetings with management to understand the difficulties the business is facing, but more, you know, of course, our raison d'etre, which is to fight the corner of editorial staff. And also we are seeing some unions taking on a more combative role, clashes, of course, between the teaching unions and the government on the question and timing of reopening of schools. So the news media industry we were going into this crisis in a very difficult position anyway, following 10, 15, 20 years of decline. And of course, we can't deny that the situation has got a lot worse with job cuts. But we are, you know, staging a fight back. We've got this recovery plan. The union at the national level is lobbying politicians. We're encouraging our members and members of the public to write to their local MPs to get them to sign up for it and back it. And we are hopeful that, you know, a lot of these measures will be taken on board. The problem, of course, is that industries across the entire economy, they're all trying to get a slice of the pie at the moment, everywhere from aviation through to restaurants and hospitality, which are really at the sharp end from having to close. That said, it does, from conversations with members of the NEC, of the National Union of Journalists, it does sound like the mood music is changing a bit, particularly around the tech giants and taxing them. So we're hopeful that something can come out of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think, again, we should add that our trade unions are only as strong as the members. So it's down to us to actually turn these bits of paper, these demands, these plans for action into something meaningful by getting some social weight behind them, which boils down to people doing things. And if nothing else has happened from this coronavirus, I think it's shown who the really essential people are in society. And it's not the bankers, it's actually the people that go and empty the bins, the people that do the deliveries, the nurses and so on. And people are finding their voice and finding some of that power. And hopefully that extends to the newsrooms and to filmmakers. So don't go away, because I've got lots of your questions coming up for all of our speakers tonight. And first off is Louise Raw has one. How do we, or can we, build a braver media? One perhaps for Ken and Sinead. Would you like to make a film set at a time of a CV-19 pandemic? I think there is a film called Pandemic, isn't there? Something which was meant to be quite prescient. I haven't seen it myself. And let's take another one. Can the BBC be saved? I know some of us are a bit conflicted by the BBC. I used to watch it avidly, but I can't stand the show anymore. But anyway, you may have different ideas. So we'll take those three questions. We'll start with Ken.
Can the BBC be saved? Yes, absolutely. I mean, the idea of public service broadcasting is I think is central to a democratic society, or a part of becoming a democratic society. I think it needs to be reorganized. It needs to be broken down into regions. It needs to be autonomy for producers, much more. It needs to have a more democratic structure in every way, so that the management groups have some responsibility, both to the people who produce the programs and obviously to wider society. I mean, I don't have a blueprint by any means, but I think that's where we need to start, is to break it up and to make it more regional, and to make it more responsive to program makers and to to society as a whole, rather than it being a top-down controlled organisation. But it needs a lot of work to come up with plans for that. I mean, that's a political decision to look in that direction, and then to work out a series of proposals. Would I like to do a film? I'd like to do a film, really. Yes, I mean, no end of things will arise after this experience. I mean, one that is discussed was touched on by what other people have said, was that there is a change of mood at the moment, a realization that we are mutually dependent on each other. We exist, our strength as a collective, where we work alongside each other, not as competitors working against each other. And that sense of togetherness, despite the political leadership we've got, is very important. And how to capitalize on that, to celebrate it, to observe it, to see it in all its contradictory elements that it will be, are stories that are very important to tell. Whether this will lead to anything, I mean, depends on the political leadership. If my fear is that we have this sensation of collaboration and working together and realizing our interdependence, but unless that is absorbed into a political program and leadership, it will gradually evaporate, like steam from a kettle, and that it needs crystallizing in a political organization, into a program, into something concrete that we can fight for, rather than just being a generalization. So I think that's the task we've got. But yeah, I mean, there's 100 films we can make about it. I just say if I can get around the course again, that's what's bothering me. And Gary, thanks a lot. In a few minutes, I'm going to have to slip back to the other piano. So excuse me if I fade away shortly. Yeah. But really a real pleasure to hear everyone speak. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Ken. Chris, would you like to come in?
Well, you mean first of all, on the question of whether the BBC can be saved. I mean, it certainly should be saved, but the issue, I think, is how we do that. Because part of the problem, I think, of the BBC is a lack of leadership at the top of the organisation, that the commitment to the values of public service broadcasting, which is completely critical. I think having a public service broadcaster, i.e., broadcaster that is not owned by a profit-seeking proprietor and is committed to a set of values that are beyond those of profit or the propagation of one particular point of view. That idea, which is enshrined in the public service broadcasting idea, is fantastically important in a democracy. But I think there's been an enormous erosion of belief in that, and a lot of the erosion of belief in it inside the BBC itself. So the challenge for us outside is whether we can create a broad enough movement that brings together all sorts of organizations in civil society that say, this is the sort of BBC that we want, and this is the BBC that we are going to work for, and this is what we're going to insist that politicians and those inside the BBC deliver. And I think, and that is what has to be done. I mean, that it will be saved and improved if those of us who care about this join together and make it something that other people care about as well. Because, I mean, just on a very, very simple level, it is still the best single value, of broadcasting that you can get. I mean, for those of us who in the lockdown have suddenly started subscribing, to Amazon and Netflix and all these things, and you just can't believe how good value, well, I've always believed this, but it just dramatically draws attention to what good value the BBC is. And that's why it should be saved, but we need to work to make it better.
Okay. Do you want to touch on anything else, Chris?
No, go on, others should have a chance.
Okay, gives more time for Sinead and Michael. Sinead?
I think it definitely can be saved, but I think there needs to be some accountability, because from all the public sector broadcasters at the moment, because actually in Scotland, the regional sort of BBC Scotland thing it's been quite a big problem in driving down the rates and the amount of money that people are getting paid for work. And I think Channel 4 just announced that they're slashing their tariffs for what they're paying for stuff, and it directly hits freelancers, it directly hits filmmakers, and really in this time I think when the film industry, when the documentary, when everyone is struggling, the BBC and Channel 4 could play a really, really important role. First of all, in ensuring safety, because they could make it mandatory that certain things had to happen. If you're going to make something for Channel 4, if you're going to make something for BBC, that things have to be in place to make that safe. But also they have to pay for it. You know, you can't, you have to make sure that money, I think this is just that's come to my head today looking into it, that you have to have money ring fenced in the budgets for programs that is specifically to deal with the crisis, you know, to pay extra for cleaners to come in and do it, because I think it's deeply unfair that the whole responsibility of a safety of a set might end up in the hands of a runner or in someone on the lowest pay. And I think the BBC could play a really, really important role in revitalizing the film industry, the documentary industry. Channel 4 could also do that. I think it's absolutely the worst possible time for them to start cutting and putting pressure on budgets for making films, because at the end of the day, who is that going to affect? It's going to affect the people who are most vulnerable in the industry. And there's this idea that they're going to pay less for programming, so they don't mind if it comes out at sort of less good quality. And it's just not true. So many people are going to be in such a weak economic position when they get back into work that they are going to want to prove themselves over and above what is expected, and competition is going to be very high. So I think public sector broadcast could play an absolutely amazing role at this moment in time. And I think we have to put pressure on them and pressure on the government to make sure that they play that role, that they don't just act like any other profit-making broadcaster. They act like a public sector broadcaster, and they support the film industry, the documentary industry, and the people coming up through it.
Thank you, Sinead. Ken, I think, has got to dash. Richard, would you like to come in?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I agree with all those points which you made, and I think I'm hopeful that public trust in the BBC as a public broadcaster will be really strengthened in this crisis. And the point that Chris made about the value for money is incredible, but unfortunately, there seems to be a really embedded cultural view that paying for your license fee somehow is like a tax. Whereas to pay for cable, Sky, or any of these online services, people are more than willing to pay. I mean, I don't know how much Sky costs nowadays, but I remember it used to be twice as much a month just so you could get some of the football. So I'm personally, like I said, really hopeful that it can change the view that the BBC, for all its faults, I think it has raised some critical coverage, not all the time, but on certain aspects. I've heard BBC journalists going outside care homes and speaking with carers and the managers of these care homes. And I think it's really encouraging that you hear that kind of coverage. And it's only from a public broadcaster that they really have the means to do that. I think the real critical point, more existentially for the BBC, will come at the point of the review of its charter, which I think is next year. And that's when I think there needs to be a really concerted movement by unions to engage the public, to convince people, to put politicians under pressure that they do properly fund it. So all the points that Sinead made about helping to revitalise the domestic film industry, ensuring that people who are lower paid, whether media workers or the supporting staff, aren't those who, they're not going to see a real decline in their living standards. But I think this ties into a broader point about public services more generally. And again, I'm quite optimistic that what's happened throughout this crisis and the fact that the government has responded with massive support packages financially, whether through the furlough or loans to businesses that are otherwise viable, that can translate. And it's something that can be capitalised upon to make the case for a strong and properly funded public sector broadcaster.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Excuse me. I think we've probably got time for just one last question. And it is the Google tax question. There is a massive demand for content. Amazon has commissioned an enormous amount of content. For example, can critical voices find a niche in or offering work to these corporate monsters to get the message out? So demand for content, and the allied question, should we tax the social media giants, and can that be used to fund the public sector of broadcasting? So start with Chris.
Yeah, let's deal with the question. I think I got this right. Is there a place on the Amazons and of this world for critical voices? And my answer to that is, I don't think that it's in the commercial interests of those organizations to commission or acquire content that doesn't deliver them audiences that deliver bottom line profits. I think that, and we make documentaries. We're always trying to get our documentaries onto those funded by or onto those channels. And the fact is that they're never going to deliver the sorts of films that we make, are never going to deliver the size of audiences that are profitable to those sorts of platforms. So I think the scope is so limited, it's negligible, right? Now, on the question of the tax, I mean, I think this. I mean, I think this is a really good idea. By the way, the tax. I think that this is one of those things that, though I've said this before, it's not enough for it to be an idea. It's got to be a social movement. We've got to find a way in which all organizations in civil society can join together around that, and probably a couple of other policies and it is an alliance between organizations outside the parliamentary process and those in Parliament to create the circumstances in which there is enough public support that politicians know that this is something that not only should be done, but can be done, and that people want to be done. And I think that is, as always, is the big challenge, is how do we turn a good policy idea into a piece of practical politics? And I think there is a chance. I agree with, Michael about this. I think, there is a chance, but it is going to be a battle. I mean, I do think, I think that the forces of the right and reaction, are not just going to roll over and give up. It's going to, and I think it's in the balance at the moment, whether the sort of optimism and the senses of solidarity and community that we've discovered exists, that we sort of always knew was there, but has now been evident in the last, 2 months. It's going to be a battle to hang on to that, because there's plenty of people who want to get rid of it. And as someone said, when the Treasury has produced a paper that suggests a freeze on the wages of workers in the National Health Service, gives us an insight into the minds of people in power. So we need to be prepared for that battle.
Thank you, Chris. Sinead.
I think on some of the streaming platforms, there is a possibility to have more, I'd say, overtly political documentaries than you might get on the BBC, for example, that films can have a very strong point of view. There's a documentary on at the moment on Netflix called Edge of Democracy, which is a very political film about the situation in Brazil. Don't love it. It's good. But it is a very, very, very political film, and it kind of puts its politics right out there. And there have been quite a lot of good films that have come out with sort of big ideas, big global ideas like Dirty Money, the Inside Job, big documentaries that deal with sort of big ideas around capitalism and corruption and things like that. And I think there is more space. I think bizarrely, the more popular Netflix becomes, though, the less space there'll be for those kind of films, because they have to now appeal to everybody in the world. Whereas before, their model was much more that they could take it seems like they could take different kinds of content, and it didn't have to appeal to everyone. As long as it appealed to some people, it would appear on their platform. Whereas I think it's become so globalized that unless it really is the broadest possible narrative, it'll probably be challenging. But I do think in some ways there's a little bit more freedom on those kind of platforms to do political films that you just can't do on the BBC. It's really difficult. We tried, we're still the only way in. And the idea of something being biased in a certain way is very problematic, when really everything's biased. You're just putting your opinion up front. So I think, you know, it's good for the BBC to have a bit of competition as well, because it does mean that it starts to pay attention to different kinds of films. It starts to worry about, you know, not getting the next big hit in a weird way, and no one really knows what that's going to be. So I think there is hope. So, and it all comes down to good story. And I would also, if anyone is listening who has like a different kind of idea, I would look to the European broadcasters as well. Arte is a brilliant channel that does a lot of very interesting things, and you can access it from the UK, and it has a lot of good documentaries on it at the moment. It's just got one that's come up, which is about photographers working in Northern Ireland, which is very political, which I don't think would be on the BBC, but is being broadcast by Arte. So that's what I'd say about that.
Thank you, Sinead. And Chris, we're both quite pertinent to what we're talking about next week, new media and trying to find spaces for new ways of doing things and on the existing platforms, if possible. Michael, would you like to, I think the bit about the Google tax hasn't really kind of been covered.
So,
maybe you want to speak to that?
That's something that the government is bringing in anyway. It's at 2%. The NUJ's proposal is that it would be tripled to 6%. So on the big tech companies, because the problem has been that because these companies are multinationals, they can shift where they book their profits, basically. And as a result, they pay very little, sometimes no corporate tax at all. So it means they can game the system. I think that would be a good way, but like has been said before, there have to be a lot of political and social force behind it. And following the crisis, there's going to be demands for reforms in a lot of areas. So it will be a struggle. I think it can be done. On the question about whether the big tech companies themselves become platforms for critical, or in my case, just, you know, for quality news content, I would like to think so, because they have loads of money, or at least they have a lot of capital from investors. They're not always that profitable yet, but they're growing massively. So, you know, from a journalist point of view, that looks like a good opportunity. However, I would be quite skeptical, because in recent experience has proven quite bitter for some news organizations. It was the example of where Facebook had its videos, and initially Facebook was paying quite a lot of legacy established news organizations to do Facebook video. Like where I work, and lots of other big newspapers were getting revenue from this. But then Facebook, they withdrew that. And at one point late, Facebook was actually accused of knowingly inflating its video metrics so that it get more money from advertisers. Now, the problem was there, you had a lot of legacy newspapers who'd gone and invested loads into video producers, video staff, and then they realized suddenly this is not going to make us any money. So I think there should be a lot of caution and skepticism towards the big tech companies, alluring as it is, because they seem to have oodles of cash to be able to invest in things. I agree as well with Sinead about it is the risk as some of these streaming platforms become ever more popular. The risk is that perhaps they lose their sharper edge and it becomes more populist. However, personally, I feel that the breadth of content that you see on Netflix now is so much wider and more appealing, and there is a lot of great quality stuff. But from my perspective, it seems that you do get a lot of diversity culturally on Netflix. I'm not so sure about its other competitors, but I don't see that necessarily translating into more of a hard news agenda, and whether they would take stuff that's on that kind of basis, and whether they would be critical of this, you know, the kind of investment that they benefit from. But then that's always been a problem with proprietorship in the news media.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just to chip in, I work at Money Observer, and we're seeing our views going up, and that's something that's happening quite a lot of mainstream online news services at the moment, but the money's all going into the pockets of Google. So that needs to be sorted and redirected, I guess. Okay, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Ken Loach, who's had to leave a little bit earlier, Christopher Hurd, the founder of Dartmouth Films, Sinead Kerwin, the director of Still the Enemy Within, which is about the miners' strike. Not sorry, but the producer. It was Owen, wasn't it? Owen Gower was the director. And I should give a shout out for that, because I get a little role in it, talking about a mining village I visited during the Great Strike. And of course, to Michael Pooler from the NUJ and a working journalist at the FT. I'm not allowed to say that. And my daughter just come in. So thank you everyone for joining us. And next week's meeting, well, first I'll get to the Saturday chat at 11 AM. But next week's meeting is on new media, what is the way forward? And we have Carrie-Anne Mendoza from the Canaries, one of the newer online titles. Steve Walker from Squawk Box, and Mike Simons, who some of you already know, is a media analyst, formerly Computer Weekly news editor, among many other things. So that's next week on the 25th of May at 7 PM, slightly earlier than today. And thanks everybody for joining us. As I say, get along to our Facebook page, go and like the page and stuff, join the group, get in touch if you want to reach out to people like Lorna, for example, at Homerton Hospital, to get stories from nurses and others on the front line. It's worth mentioning that NHS management are now telling staff not to complain about PPE publicly. So it's getting harder to get hold of whistleblowers, but that's our job to actually dig them out and to help support them and offer solidarity. So we'll be talking about that and many other things on the Saturday coffee shops at 11 AM. You're very welcome to come along, find the details on the Facebook group. Thanks for joining us today. See you next week. And thanks to all our speakers.